Can you imagine waking to find frost crystals growing on the inside of your bedroom window? Picture stepping outside into air so sharp it burns your lungs with each breath. Where the wind doesn't just blow, it cuts through wool and leather as if they were paper. What would it feel like to know that your very survival depends not on conquering the elements, but simply on outlasting them, one frozen day at a time? Tonight, we're drifting back to the American frontier of the 1870s and 1880s, to a time when winter wasn't just a season. It was a test of human endurance that lasted for months. We'll walk softly through the snow-covered plains of Nebraska, Dakota Territory, Wyoming, and Montana, where ordinary people faced extraordinary cold with nothing but their wits, their neighbors, and whatever scraps of warmth they could gather around them. If this kind of gentle storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're about to discover how people endured the merciless winters of the Wild West, not with heroic drama, but with the slow, steady rhythm of survival itself. The first thing you notice before you even open your eyes is the sound of your own breathing. Each exhale creates a small puff of vapor that hangs in the air above your face, visible even in the dim pre-dawn darkness of your cabin. The wool blanket pulled up to your chin feels stiff with cold, and somewhere beneath the layers of quilts and buffalo hide, your body has curled into itself, seeking every scrap of warmth it can find. Imagine yourself there, in a one-room log cabin somewhere on the Nebraska plains in the winter of 1876. The walls around you are chinkicked with mud and prairie grass, but the wind finds every gap, whistling through the spaces between logs with a sound that never stops. It's become the soundtrack of your winter, that constant low moaning that speaks of endless cold, stretching across thousands of miles of open grassland. Your feet hit the wooden floor, and the shock of cold shoots up through your legs like electricity. The floorboards, made from whatever timber could be hauled across the prairie, have gaps between them wide enough to see the frozen ground beneath the cabin. You've stuffed these cracks with rags and newspaper, but the cold seeps through anyway, patient and persistent. The rhythm of your days begins before sunrise. Always the same routine born of necessity. First, you must tend the fire that has burned low through the night. The embers glow like tiny orange eyes in the darkness, and you feed them carefully with whatever fuel you have. Split logs if you're fortunate, twisted hay if you're not, or perhaps dried buffalo dung collected from the prairie during warmer months. The smell of burning dung isn't pleasant, but it burns hot and long, and you've learned not to be particular about such things. Your hands move stiffly as you coax the flames higher. Even indoors, your fingers are sluggish with cold, the joints reluctant to bend. You flex them repeatedly, trying to work, feeling back into the tips, knowing that today's survival depends on your ability to grip an axe handle, thread a needle, or milk a cow, with hands that often feel more like wooden clubs attached to your wrists. The water bucket by the door is solid ice, as it is every morning. You take the metal dipper and strike the surface, breaking through the crust with sharp, ringing blows that echo in the small space. The sound carries in the cold air. Your nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, but sometimes the strange acoustics of winter on the plains, you can hear the faint echo of their morning routine, the distant sound of axes and hammers, and the occasional lowing of cattle. As you melt ice over the fire for drinking water and coffee, you can see your breath streaming in the cold air even inside the cabin. The single window, made from real glass, if you were lucky enough to afford it, or oiled paper, if you weren't, is completely opaque with frost. Beautiful, intricate patterns of ice crystals have grown across its surface during the night. Nature's artwork that no one has time to admire. The coffee, when it finally comes, is weak and bitter, made from beans that have been stretched with kori and roasted barley. But the hot liquid feels like life flowing back into your chest. You cup the tin mug in both hands, feeling the warmth seep through the metal into your palms. And for a moment, this simple pleasure makes the day seem possible. But the day's work cannot wait. The animals in the Leanto barn attached to your cabin are depending on you. You pull on layer after layer of clothing, a wool shirt, cotton dress, or work pants, a heavy coat made from whatever fabric you could acquire, mittens knitted from unraveled yarn, boots that may or may not be waterproof, depending on how well you've been able to patch them with grease and scraps of leather. Stepping outside is like walking into a wall of cold that takes your breath away. The air is so sharp, it makes your chest ache and your eyes water immediately, the tears freezing on your cheeks before they can fall. The wind across the open prairie is relentless, carrying snow that stings like sand, whipping around the corners of your cabin and finding every opening in your clothing. The snow beneath your feet squeaks with each step, a sound unique to truly cold snow. When the temperature has dropped so low that the ice crystals themselves become hard and brittle, you've learned to read the language of snow. Wet snow that soaks through everything. Dry snow that the wind can sculpt into drifts taller than your cabin. In this bitter squeaking snow that tells you the mercury and the thermometer has dropped below zero, your small barn is a miracle of makeshift engineering. Logs and saw and whatever boards could be scavenged. Built to shelter a milk cow, perhaps a few chickens, maybe a horse if you're prosperous. The animals huddle together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. The cow's udder is nearly frozen, and milking becomes a delicate negotiation between your numb fingers and her discomfort. The milk steams as it hits the metal pail, and you work quickly, knowing it will begin to freeze if left in the cold air too long. The chickens, if they've survived this long into winter, have stopped laying eggs weeks ago. They huddled together in whatever nest boxes you've been able to construct. Feathers fluffed out to trap warm air, beaks tucked under wings. Some mornings you find one that didn't make it through the night, frozen solid on the roost, and you add it to the pot for stew without ceremony. Sentiment is a luxury you cannot afford when survival depends on consuming every calorie available. Back inside the cabin, the contrast feels almost tropical, though you know the temperature has barely risen above freezing despite the fire. Your family moves through the morning routine with efficient silence. There's no energy to waste on unnecessary words when every breath creates a visible cloud and every movement must be calculated to conserve warmth. Breakfast might be salt pork and beans if supplies are holding out, or perhaps just cornbread, made with flour that may have been stretched with ground bark or sawdust, depending on how long the trains have been unable to get through. You eat standing close to the fire, shifting from foot to keep blood moving in your legs. And every bite is eaten with gratitude. Not for the taste, but for the simple fact that there is something to eat at all. The children, if there are children, wear layers of clothing that make them look like small bundled packages. They move carefully in their bulky clothes, and their cheeks are perpetually red from the cold. Play is a luxury when survival requires constant attention. But sometimes you catch them making small games, from the frost patterns on the window, or building tiny snow figures with the snow that is blown in through the gaps in the walls. As the short winter day progresses, the sun, when it appears at all through the gray clouds, provides little warmth, but offers a pale reminder that somewhere beyond this endless cold, spring still exists as a possibility. The light through the frost-covered window creates a dim, dream-like quality inside the cabin, where every surface is touched with cold, and every task requires twice the effort it would in warmer weather. Your hands are constantly moving, knitting, mending, whittling, doing anything to keep the fingers active and the blood flowing. The women work on quilts, piecing together scraps of fabric with stitches that must be precise despite numb fingertips. The men tend to tools and equipment, sharpening axes and knives, repairing harness and gear, all while breathing on their hands to keep them flexible enough to work. The afternoon brings the constant task of tending the fire. Wood is precious. Every log must be split and stored carefully, and the fire must be maintained at just the right level to provide warmth without wasting fuel. You've learned to bank the coals in a way that will keep heat radiating through the night. And the sound of your axe splitting kindling has become as regular as your heartbeat. As evening approaches, the temperature drops even further. The cold seems to press against the cabin walls like a living thing, seeking entrance through every crack and crevice. You stuff rags and paper into gaps that appeared fine during the day, but now whistle with escaping heat. The wind picks up, and the cabin cocks and settles under the pressure of the gusts. Dinner is often the same beans and salt pork, perhaps with some dried corn if the harvest was good and the storage is held out. You eat by firelight, conserving the precious candles or oil for necessary tasks. The food is warm and filling, but the constant cold means your body burns through calories quickly, leaving you always slightly hungry, always craving more fat and warmth than your supplies can provide. The evening routine begins early, as daylight fades by 4 in the depths of winter. The animals must be checked one more time, fed what hay you can spare, their water unfrozen enough to drink. You bank the fire carefully, adding logs that will burn slowly through the night, and arrange the embers to radiate heat for as long as possible. Bedtime means stripping down quickly in the cold air and diving under layers of quilts and blankets and buffalo robes. Sometimes sharing body heat with family members, sometimes heated by stones that have been warmed by the fire and wrapped in cloth. The bed is often just a straw mattress on a wooden frame, but the layers of covering create a small pocket of warmth that feels like luxury after the day's constant battle against the cold. As you settle into sleep, the sounds of winter continue outside. The wind moaning across the prairie, the occasional crack of freezing wood, the distant howl of wolves or coyotes. Sometimes the cold is so intense you can hear the very air itself, a subtle creaking and settling as moisture freezes and expands. The rhythm of these days repeats endlessly through the winter months. Wake, tend, fire, break ice, feed animals, conserve fuel, mend and repair, eat sparingly, sleep in layers, and wake again to the same challenges. There is no drama in this survival, no heroic moments, just the slow, patient endurance of people who understand that spring will come eventually, but only if they can outlast the winter one day at a time. And in the deep quiet of those long nights, as you drift between wakefulness and sleep, you sometimes think about the vast emptiness outside your cabin walls. Thousands of miles of frozen prairie stretching to the horizon, dotted here and there with other small lights. Other families huddled around their own fires. All of you connected by the shared understanding that you are very small in the face of the cold, and that your survival depends not on conquering winter, but on simply breathing through it, one frost-clouded breath at a time. As the sun fades behind the endless white horizon, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of amber and rose that seem almost too beautiful for such a harsh landscape, let's shift our attention to a particular winter, particular man, and a story that echoes the experience of thousands who faced the most brutal season the frontier had ever seen. The winter of 1880 to 1881 would come to be known simply as the Hard Winter. And in a small cabin near DMET, Dakota Territory, a man named Nelson's story was about to discover just how hard winter could be, how it could strip away everything except the most essential elements of human survival, and reveal what truly mattered when everything else was gone. Nelson had come west with the same dreams that drew so many others. Land of his own, vast and unbroken as far as the eye could see. A future built with his own hands and the sweat of his brow. Prosperity earned through honest work rather than inherited privilege or urban cunning. He'd claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act, walking the boundaries of his property on that first day, with a surveyor's chain and iron stakes, marking corners that seemed to define not just land, but possibility itself. The soil was rich and black beneath the prairie grass, and when he held it in his hands, it felt like holding the future. The cabin he built with his own timber was modest but sturdy, its logs chinkalked with clay and prairie grass, its single room designed to hold everything a family needed to begin a new life. He had selected each log carefully, choosing straight, grained oak and ash from the creek bottom, seasoning the wood through one summer before raising the walls the next. The roof was sawed over rough planking, and when the spring rains came, it would bloom with wild flowers, as if the very house were reaching toward the sky. His wife Sarah had sewn curtains for their single window from fabric she had brought from their old home in Illinois. Blue calico with tiny white flowers that reminded her of the garden she had left behind. Those curtains represented more than decoration. They were an assertion of civilization, a declaration that this rough cabin would be a home, not merely a shelter. She had also brought her mother's china teacups, packed carefully in a barrel with her quilts. On Sundays, she would serve coffee in those delicate cups, as if they were still sitting in a proper parlor, instead of on a rough plank table lit by a single coal oil lamp. Their two young children, 8-year-old Mary and 6-year-old Tom, had run barefoot through the tall grass that first summer, chasing marks whose yellow breasts flashed like small suns as they rose and fell above the prairie swells. Tom collected bird eggs and unusual stones, filling his pockets with treasures that seemed magical in this vast new world. Mary helped her mother tend a small garden behind the cabin where they grew beans and squash and pumpkins that swelled under the generous sun. The children had adapted to their new home with the easy resilience of youth, finding adventure where adults saw only hardship and isolation. The summer of 1880 had seemed to promise everything they'd hoped for and more. Nelson's first crops, wheat and corn and oats, had grown green and strong under the prairie sun, ripening into golden waves that rustled in the constant wind with a sound like distant applause. He had cut and stacked hay in neat rows, building up stores of feed for the livestock that would see them through the winter. The cellar beneath the cabin was filled with potatoes and turnips and carrots, barrels of salt pork, and sacks of flour and beans. They had prepared, he thought, for anything winter might bring. But by October, the signs were troubling to those who knew how to read them. The geese flew south earlier than usual. Their formations stretched across the sky and urgent, ragged lines that spoke of some primal knowledge, some instinct that warned of danger ahead. Nelson had watched them pass overhead day after day, great dark V's moving with purposeful haste, and he had felt the first stirrings of unease. The Native Americans who sometimes traded at the settlement, Kota and Dakota, who still moved through their ancestral lands despite the pressure of white settlement, spoke quietly of a winter that would test all things living, using words in their own languages that the settlers couldn't translate, but somehow understood. The cattlemen, who grazed their herds on the open range, noticed their animals growing thicker coats sooner than usual, developing the heavy winter hair that usually didn't appear until December. The horses grew shaggy and seemed restless, pawing at the ground as if searching for something they couldn't find. Even the wild animals behaved strangely, rabbits staying closer to shelter, prairie dogs disappearing into their burrows earlier each day, birds gathering in larger flocks as if seeking safety in numbers. The older settlers, those weathered men and women who had survived previous hard years, began laying in supplies with an intensity that made newcomers like Nelson uneasy. Henrik Larsson, the Norwegian homesteader, whose cabin lay 2 sections to the west, spent entire days cutting wood, splitting logs into pieces small enough to burn efficiently, stacking them in careful cords against the north wall of his cabin. When Nelson asked him about his urgency, Henrik had simply looked at the clear autumn sky and said, "The wind. She tells me things." "You listen to the wind, Nelson? She don't lie." Old Mrs. Patterson, the widow who lived alone in a dugout built into a hillside, peered at the general store in town, ordering supplies that seemed excessive for one woman. Hundreds of pounds of flour, salt, beans, dried apples. When the storekeeper asked if she was planning to feed an army, she fixed him with a stern look and said, "Young man, I lived through the winter of '68 in Minnesota. I know what hunger looks like, and I know what death looks like. Better to have too much than too little." The first snow came in early November, not the light dusting that might melt by afternoon under a generous sun, but heavy wet flakes that fell steadily for 3 days and nights, accumulating with a relentlessness that seemed almost personal, as if winter had decided to settle in and stay. Nelson stood at his window on the first morning, watching the snowfall and thick curtains that reduced visibility to just a few yards. The familiar landmarks of his property, the windmill, the barn, the fence posts that marked his pasture, became ghostly shapes that appeared and disappeared in the swirling white. When the snow finally stopped, the drifts reached the bottom sill of Nelson's cabin window. The path to his barn had disappeared entirely, leaving only a smooth expanse of white that gave no indication of what lay beneath. The children pressed their faces to the glass, marveling at how the world had been transformed overnight. But Nelson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was more snow than he had expected, more than the old-timers had predicted, and it was only November. But this was just the beginning, a gentle introduction to what was coming. By December, the snow lay 4 feet deep on the level ground. The wind had sculpted it into drifts that stood 8 and 10 feet high, creating a landscape that no longer resembled the familiar prairie Nelson had known and loved. The wind seemed to have a personality of its own, howling around the cabin with voices that sounded almost human, reshaping the snow into fantastic forms that changed daily. Some drifts were carved into smooth curves like frozen waves, while others stood in sharp ridges that could cut the wind, and a man in two. The familiar landmarks that had defined Nelson's world, the lone cottonwood tree where he had often rested during summer work, the creek bed where the children had played and splashed, even his own property markers that he had set with such care, vanished beneath the white expanse as completely as if they had never existed. The world had become a place of smooth, rolling curves, where once there had been distinct features, a place that seemed to belong to another planet entirely. Navigation became a matter of life and death. Men had been known to lose their way between house and barn, wandering in circles until they froze to death within sight of safety. Nelson strung a rope between his cabin and barn, checking it daily to make sure it hadn't been cut by drifting ice or blown away by the wind. That rope became a lifeline in the most literal sense, the thin thread that connected him to his livestock, and more importantly, to the possibility of finding his way home if the snow began to fall while he was doing chores. Nelson's routine became a carefully choreographed dance of survival, each movement planned and executed with the precision of a military operation. Each morning, he would dig a new path to the barn using a shovel he kept by the door specifically for this purpose, knowing that by evening the path would be filled again with drifting snow that moved like a living thing, constantly seeking the low places, constantly erasing human efforts to impose order on the landscape. The digging itself was exhausting work. The snow was often packed hard by the wind, requiring him to chip away at it piece by piece, and the cold made his muscles ache within minutes of beginning work. His hands, despite the heavy mittens Sarah had knitted for him, become numb and clumsy, making it difficult to grip the shovel handle. More than once, he had to return to the cabin to warm his fingers by the fire before continuing. Precious time lost when every moment of daylight was needed for essential tasks. The barn itself was half buried, its roof barely visible above the drifts, and he had to climb down into it as if descending into a cave. The entrance required constant maintenance, as snow would blow in and accumulate faster than it could be removed. He built a small windbreak from old boards and canvas, but even this required daily adjustment as the wind shifted, found new ways to deposit snow exactly where he didn't want it. His 3 cows, Bessie, the Holeen that had been his first purchase, Daisy, the Jersey that gave the richest milk, and Mabel, the crossbred that was the most hardy, huddled together in the dim space of the barn, their breath creating a constant fog that froze on the rough wooden walls and thick layers of white frost. The barn was warmer than the outside air, but not by much, and ice formed on everything. The water buckets, the stall doors, even the animals' whiskers and eyelashes. Cows' udders required special attention, as frostbite could end their milk production permanently. Nelson would warm his hands thoroughly before milking, and he learned to work quickly, getting the milk into covered pails before it could begin to freeze. Even so, he often found ice crystals forming on the surface by the time he returned to the cabin, and Sarah would have to strain the milk carefully before they could use it. The hay he had cut and stored through the summer, great stacks of prairie grass, and timothy that had seemed so abundant in October, was disappearing faster than he had calculated. Each day, he measured out careful portions for the animals. Using a scale he had improvised from a board in stones, knowing that if he fed them too little, they would die of starvation and cold. But if he fed them too much, the hay would run out before spring, with the same fatal result. Was a mathematics of survival that had no room for error, a calculation that kept him awake at night as he listened to the wind howl around the cabin. He had estimated the winter would last 5 months, from November through March. But what if it lasted longer? What if spring came late, as it sometimes did on the prairie? He had enough hay for 5 months if he rationed carefully. But 6 months would require cutting the animals' rations to a level that might not sustain them. Some nights, he lay awake listening to the cattle moving restlessly in their stalls, hearing them low softly in the darkness, and he wondered which would give out first, the hay or the winter. The sound of their distress troubled him more than his own discomfort, for the animals depended entirely on his care, and their suffering was a weight on his conscience that made sleep difficult, even when exhaustion demanded it. Sarah, lying beside him under quilts that never seemed quite warm enough, would sometimes reach over and touch his arm, understanding his worry without words. "They're strong animals," she would whisper in the darkness. "They'll make it. We all will." But he could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the way she spoke as much to convince herself as to comfort him. By January, the trains had stopped running entirely. The great iron horses that had seemed so powerful and unstoppable, defeated by something as simple as snow. The railroad tracks disappeared under snowdrifts that in some places were 20 feet deep. And even the powerful locomotives, with their cow catchers and snow plows, couldn't push through the walls of snow that blocked the passes and filled the cuts where the tracks ran between hills. The railroad companies had tried to keep the lines open, sending crews out with shovels, and even attempting to use dynamite to blast through some of the larger drifts. But for every mile they cleared, 2 more would be blocked by the next storm, and eventually they admitted defeat and suspended service until spring. The last train to reach Dieppe had arrived on January 15th, carrying mail and supplies that seemed like treasures from another world. This cessation of railroad service meant no supplies, no mail, no connection to the outside world beyond the Dakota Territory. Nelson's family, like hundreds of others scattered across the territory, was entirely on their own, cut off as completely as if they lived on an island in the middle of an ocean. The isolation was almost as hard to bear as the cold and the diminishing supplies, for it meant that no help could come, no matter how desperate their situation became. The coffee ran out first, that precious luxury that had made the morning chores bearable. As Sarah had rationed it carefully, using fewer and fewer grounds each day, until the resulting liquid was barely colored water. But even this, careful conservation couldn't make it last forever. The loss of coffee was more than the loss of a beverage. It was the loss of a ritual. It's a moment of warmth and comfort that had begun each day with something approaching normally. Then the sugar disappeared, the white crystals that had sweetened their cornbread and made the children's porridge palatable. Sarah tried honey when they could get it, and even attempted to make syrup from beets. But nothing quite replaced the simple sweetness that had made their simple meals more enjoyable. The children, especially young Tom, missed the occasional piece of candy or sweet cake that had made special occasions feel special. The flour came next, that fundamental staple that had provided bread and biscuits and pancakes. Learned to make bread from the wheat Nelson had ground by hand, using an old coffee mill. It's a process that was laborious and produced a coarse, dark flour that made heavy, dense loaves. But even this inferior bread was better than no bread at all. The children grew accustomed to meals that consisted of little more than beans and salt pork day after day after day. The monotony of their diet was almost as wearing as the hunger itself. Without variety, without the small pleasures of different flavors and textures, eating became merely a necessity rather than a comfort. Sarah tried to create variation by cooking the same ingredients in different ways. Beans baked one day, boiled the next, mashed into a paste, and fried as patties on the third day. But there was only so much that could be done with such limited ingredients. The salt pork, their primary source of protein, had to be used sparingly. Each piece was precious, and Sarah would save the fat to cook other foods, wasting nothing. She learned to make soup from bones that had already been used for one meal, extracting every bit of nutrition from their dwindling supplies. The children, who had been accustomed to meat at every meal, learned to be grateful for small portions and to chew slowly to make the experience last longer. The cold was unlike anything Nelson had experienced, even during harsh winters in Illinois. The thermometer he had hung outside his door registered temperatures that seemed impossible. 30 below zero, then 40 below, then 50 below. At such temperatures, the air itself seemed to become solid, thick, and painful to breathe, requiring conscious effort to draw into the lungs. The cold had a quality that was almost alive, a presence that penetrated everything and seemed determined to find its way into every space where warmth might hide. It crept through chinks in the cabin walls. Despite the careful chinking Nelson had done in the fall, it rose from the floor, which was never quite warm. Despite the constant fire, it lurked in corners and under furniture, waiting to ambush anyone who moved away from the stove. Spit froze before it hit the ground, a phenomenon that fascinated and horrified Tom. Tested it repeatedly until his father forbade the practice, fearing the boy would injure his mouth. The moisture from their breath created layers of ice on the inside walls of the cabin, building up gradually until the walls were covered with a coating of frost that glittered in the lamplight like diamonds, but spoke of how little their small fire could do against the vast cold outside. In the mornings, they would chip the ice away with knives, collecting it in pots and pans to melt for water, because the well had frozen solid clear to the bottom, 20 feet down into the earth. The well water, when they could get it, was so cold it made their teeth ache. But it was precious because it meant they didn't have to melt snow, a process that consumed fuel they could barely spare. The process of obtaining water became a major daily task. Snow had to be gathered in buckets and brought inside to melt. But snow contained surprisingly little water. A bucket of snow yielded perhaps 2 inches of water in the bottom. This meant that enormous quantities of snow had to be processed to meet their basic needs for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing. Bathing became a luxury they couldn't afford, both because of the scarcity of water and the impossibility of heating enough to fill even a small tub. They learned to live with the smell of unwashed bodies, with hair that grew lank and greasy, with skin that became rough and chapped, despite Sarah's carefully hoarded hand cream. Personal hygiene, once taken for granted, became another casualty of the winter's siege. The cabin itself seemed to shrink as the cold intensified. They moved their activities closer and closer to the stove, abandoning the far corners of the room where the cold gathered like a living thing. Their world contracted to a small circle around the fire, where they ate and worked and played and slept, huddled together for warmth and companionship. In his letters to his brother back in Illinois, letters that wouldn't be delivered until spring, if then, Nelson wrote with careful understatement about their situation. The restrained language of a man who didn't want to worry his relatives or admit the full extent of his family's peril. The winter has been somewhat more severe than we anticipated, he wrote in his neat, cramped handwriting, forming the letters carefully, despite his numbed fingers. Sarah and the children are bearing up well, though we find ourselves somewhat restricted in our movements. Between the lines of such careful language lay the daily reality of a family slowly consuming everything they had managed to save, with no certainty that spring would come in time to save them. He didn't write about the nights when they went to bed hungry, or the way little Tom had grown thin and pale, or the persistent cough that troubled Sarah and seemed to grow worse each day. He didn't mention the fear that kept him awake at night, the calculations he ran over and over in his mind, how many days of food remained, how long the fuel would last, whether they could survive until April or May, when the snow might finally begin to melt. These were private terrors, not to be shared even with family members who might worry about them but could do nothing to help. The children, 8-year-old Mary and 6-year-old Tom, adapted to their confined world with the resilience of youth. Finding ways to entertain themselves within the strict boundaries imposed by cold and scarcity, they played quiet games in the cabin's single room, building miniature houses from corn cobs and scraps of wood, creating elaborate stories about tiny families who lived in these doll houses and faced adventures that were somehow always less dangerous than their own reality. Mary, the older child, had learned to help her mother with household tasks. Standing on a wooden crate to reach the table where she would need bread or mend clothing, her small fingers were clever with a needle, and she took pride in her ability to patch patches, making clothes last far longer than they were ever intended to. She had also become expert at entertaining her younger brother, telling him stories from memory, or making up new ones when the old ones grew stale. Tom, naturally energetic and restless, struggled more with the confinement. He would pace the small cabin like a caged animal, looking longingly out the window at the snow-covered world he couldn't explore. Sarah learned to give him small tasks that made him feel useful. Sorting beans, stacking firewood, helping to measure out supplies, anything that would channel his energy in useful directions. Their laughter, when it came, sounded strange in the muffled silence of the snow-covered world, echoing off the frost-covered walls with a hollow quality that reminded everyone how isolated they were. But it reminded Nelson and Sarah that life continued even in the midst of such hardship, that children could find joy even in the darkest circumstances, and that hope was not something that could be extinguished by cold or hunger or fear. Sarah's strength became the family's anchor, the fixed point around which their daily survival revolved. She rationed their supplies with mathematical precision, keeping careful records in a small notebook of every ounce of flour, every bean, every scrap of meat that passed through their kitchen. Her calculations were complex, balancing nutritional needs against available supplies, trying to stretch their food without starving anyone. She made meals from ingredients that would have seemed impossible to combine in better times. Flour mixed with ground acorns Tom had gathered in the fall, soup made from potato peels, and beef bones that had already been used twice before. Bread that was more beans than wheat, but still filled hungry stomachs. Her cooking became an act of alchemy, transforming meager ingredients into meals that not only sustained life, but occasionally even pleased the palate. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and the families gathered around the stove for warmth, she would read aloud from their single-book Bible that her mother had given her when she married, its leather binding worn smooth by years of handling. Her voice, clear and steady, created a small island of normalcy in the vast ocean of cold and uncertainty that surrounded them. The familiar words of the Psalms and Gospels took on new meaning in their desperate circumstances. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," became not just a statement of faith, but a daily prayer for survival. "Give us this day our daily bread" was no longer a metaphor, but a literal plea. The Bible stories of hardship and redemption resonated with their own experience, providing comfort and strength when both were desperately needed. Sarah also maintained the family's educational routine, insisting that Mary and Tom continue their lessons despite everything else that was happening. She had brought a few books from Illinois, a reader, a simple arithmetic book, a collection of poetry, and she used these to maintain some semblance of normal childhood development. In the afternoons, when the light was best, the children would sit at the table with their books while Sarah worked nearby. The sound of reading voices, another assertion of civilization against the wilderness outside. The neighbors, when they could reach each other at all, shared what little they had with a generosity that spoke to the best of human nature. Old Henrik, the Norwegian homesteader 2 sections over, appeared at Nelson's door one February morning like a figure from a winter fairy tale. Covered in snow from head to foot, icicles hanging from his beard, carrying a sack of dried fish that his wife had prepared the previous summer. Henrik's journey to reach Nelson's cabin had been an epic of determination and endurance. He had walked for hours through snow that was often waist-deep, following a route he had memorized by landmarks that were now buried. Twice he had become disoriented and had to backtrack, using the wind direction and the position of the sun to find his way. When he finally reached the cabin, his face was so frostbitten that Sarah had to warm it gradually with cool water before he could speak clearly. They sat by Nelson's fire and shared coffee made from roasted wheat, a bitter beverage that bore little resemblance to real coffee, but was warm and stimulating. Henrik spoke quietly about his own struggles, his words careful and deliberate as he chose between English and Norwegian, sometimes lapsing into his native language when emotion overcame his vocabulary. He told them how he had lost one of his horses to the cold, when the animal had somehow gotten out of the barn during a blizzard and been found frozen solid the next morning. The loss was devastating both emotionally and practically, as the horse had been essential for spring plowing. He was now feeding his remaining animals the thatching from his roof, pulling out the straw and prairie grass that had been meant to provide insulation, gambling that he could replace it before next winter. His wife Ingrid had sent along not just the dried fish, but also a small pot of pine needle tea, a remedy she had learned from her grandmother in Norway. The tea was rich in vitamins that could help prevent scurvy, a disease that had claimed several lives during hard winters in the old country. Sarah accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, understanding that Henrik's family was sacrificing their own comfort to help their neighbors. These visits were rare treasures in the isolation of the hard winter, moments of human connection that reminded them they were not alone in their struggle. The simple act of conversation with someone outside the family circle was precious beyond description, a reminder that the world beyond their cabin still existed and that spring would eventually restore the community connections that winter had severed. Sometimes a neighbor wouldn't be seen for weeks, their absence a source of growing concern that could only be resolved when the weather permitted someone to make the dangerous journey to check on them. These welfare visits were acts of heroism that often went unrecorded. Men and women risking their own lives to ensure that their neighbors were still alive. When the snows finally melted enough to allow more regular travel, the community would discover the cost of their isolation in stark and painful terms. The Johnson family, who had homesteaded a few miles to the east, had burned their furniture to stay warm when their coal ran out in January. They had started with chairs and tables, then moved on to bed frames and dressers, finally burning even their children's wooden toys in a desperate attempt to keep their fire going. When neighbors finally reached them, in late February, they found the family huddled in a cabin that contained almost nothing except the stove and the clothes on their backs. The house that had once been a comfortable home was now an empty shell, its furnishings converted to ash and memory. But the family was alive, and in that winter, mere survival was counted as victory. The young couple from Ohio, the Brennan, who had arrived just the previous spring, full of hope and determination, had lost their baby to pneumonia in January. The infant, barely 6 months old, had developed a cough that grew worse despite Martha Brennan's desperate nursing. Without proper medicine or the ability to get medical help, they could only watch helplessly as their child's condition deteriorated. They had buried the tiny body in a makeshift grave behind their cabin, wrapped in Martha's best shawl, but the ground was frozen too hard to dig properly. The grave was shallow, marked only by a crude wooden cross that Patrick Brennan had carved with tears freezing on his cheeks. They knew they would have to properly bury their child when the ground thawed. But for now, the small mound of snow marked a loss that was almost too large to bear. These losses were absorbed into the collective memory of the settlement, without fanfare or dramatic mourning. They were simply part of the price of winter. On the frontier, entries in an accounting book of survival that recorded both victories and defeats with equal starkness. The community had learned to grieve quietly and quickly, because dwelling on loss too long was a luxury they couldn't afford when their own survival remained in doubt. But the losses weren't forgotten. Names were remembered. Stories were told. The empty cabins served as silent reminders of how thin the line was between survival and disaster. Each family that made it through the winter carried the memory of those who didn't, a weight of survivors' guilt that would influence their decisions for years to come. As February stretched into March, Nelson began to worry that spring might not come at all, that the normal cycle of seasons had somehow been broken, and winter had become a permanent condition. The snow showed no signs of melting, and if anything, it seemed to be accumulating even faster, as storm after storm swept across the plains with renewed fury. Their supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The beans were nearly gone, counted out each day like precious coins. The salt pork had been reduced to small pieces that were more fat than meat, providing flavor for the thin soups that had become their primary sustenance. They were eating seed wheat that was meant for spring planting, a desperate measure that mortgaged their future against their present survival. The consumption of seed wheat was perhaps the most difficult decision Nelson had to make during the entire winter. Those precious kernels represented not just potential food for the coming year, but the very foundation of their future on the homestead. Without seed to plant, there would be no crop. And without a crop, they would have no way to support themselves through another year. But faced with the immediate prospect of starvation, the choice was clear, even if it was devastating. Nelson measured out the wheat grain by grain, using only what was absolutely necessary to keep his family alive, saving every kernel he could for planting, calculated and recalculated, trying to determine the minimum they needed to survive against the minimum they needed to plant a viable crop. Some evenings, as the wind howled around their cabin with renewed fury, it seemed to Nelson that winter had become a permanent condition, that the world had shifted on its axis and would never again know warmth. The cold seemed to have a malevolent intelligence, finding new ways to torment them just when they thought they had adapted to its presence. The wind was the worst part, more than the cold, or the snow, or even the hunger. It never stopped, never even paused for breath. Howling around the cabin with voices that sometimes sounded human, sometimes like wild animals, sometimes like demons from hell itself. It found every crack and crevice in their defenses, probing constantly for weaknesses, bringing news of the vast emptiness that surrounded them. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the signs of change began to appear to those who knew how to look for them. The quality of light through their frost-covered windows shifted subtly, staying bright a few minutes longer each day, as the sun traced a higher arc across the sky. It was a change measured in minutes rather than hours. But to people who had lived in semi-darkness for months, those extra minutes of daylight were precious beyond description. The wind, while still fierce and unrelenting, began to carry different scents. Not just the clean, empty smell of snow that had dominated for so long, but hints of earth and moisture that spoke of transformation somewhere beneath the frozen surface. It was a subtle change, often masked by the overwhelming smell of cold and snow. But occasionally, when the wind shifted just right, there was something else, something that spoke of life, stirring in hidden places. The animals seemed to sense the change before the humans did. The cows became more restless in their stalls, lowing more frequently and with a different tone, as if they were responding to some signal the humans couldn't detect. Even the barn cats, who had spent months in a state of semi-hibernation, began to move around more, exploring corners they had abandoned to the cold. Nelson began to notice that the snow, while still deep and persistent, had a different quality. It was softer somehow, more likely to compress under his feet, rather than crack and crunch. The drifts, while still massive, seemed less permanent, as if they were beginning to settle and consolidate rather than continuing to build endlessly higher. When the thaw finally came, it arrived not as the gentle spring Nelson remembered from his childhood in Illinois, but as a violent flood of melting snow and ice that transformed the landscape with frightening speed. The creek that had been frozen solid for months, its surface buried under feet of snow, became a rushing torrent that swept away everything in its path. Fence posts, shed roofs, piles of firewood that had been carefully stacked and counted. The sound of running water was shocking after months of winter silence. It started as a trickle, barely audible beneath the wind, but within hours it had become a roar that could be heard from inside the cabin. Nelson stood at his window, watching in amazement as water appeared where none had been visible for months, carving new channels through the snow and revealing the familiar contours of his land. The roads became impassable rivers of mud mixed with chunks of ice and debris from the winter's accumulation. What had been solid snowpack became a quagmire that could swallow a horse to its belly, trapping anyone foolish enough to attempt travel. The transformation was so rapid that it seemed almost magical, as if the earth were waking from a deep sleep and shaking off the winter's burden with violent enthusiasm. The landscape revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in solution, showing a world transformed by months of burial under snow. Familiar landmarks appeared in unexpected places, shifted by the weight and movement of ice. Fences had been moved by drifting snow. Buildings had shifted on their foundations, and trees bore scars from the winter's assault that would mark them for years to come. But most shocking of all was the revelation of winter's casualties. As the snow melted, it revealed the bodies of animals that had died during the worst storms, cattle that had wandered from shelter and frozen, wild animals that had succumbed to starvation, and domestic animals like chickens and pigs that had somehow escaped their shelters and paid the ultimate price for their freedom. The dead animals had to be disposed of quickly before they could contaminate water sources or spread disease. It was grim work made more difficult by the muddy conditions and the emotional weight of seeing the winter's toll laid out so starkly. Each carcass represented a loss not just of property, but of hope, a reminder of how close they had all come to joining the ranks of winter's victims. Nelson and his family survived the hard winter, but they were changed by it in ways both obvious and subtle. The children had grown thin and quiet, aged beyond their years by months of privation and constraint. Mary, once a chatterbox, who filled the cabin with constant conversation, had learned to speak only when necessary, conserving energy like everything else in their survival equation. Tom, previously a bundle of endless energy, moved more slowly and seemed to tire easily, his natural exuberance dampened by the winter's harsh lessons. Zara had developed a persistent cough that would trouble her for years to come, a legacy of breathing cold air and living in close quarters where illness spread easily. The cough was deep and harsh, sometimes keeping the family awake at night and serving as a constant reminder of the price they had paid for survival. Despite various remedies, pine needle tea, honey when they could get it, steamed from boiled water, the cough persisted, becoming part of who she was. Nelson himself found that he looked at the world differently now, always calculating, always planning for the next winter, it never again trusting in the simple abundance of summer. The easy confidence he had felt during that first golden summer on the homestead was gone, replaced by a hard-earned wisdom about the precarious nature of life on the frontier. He had learned that prosperity could vanish overnight, that careful preparation was the difference between life and death, and that the prairie, for all its beauty, was not a forgiving place. The experience had aged him visibly. His hair had grown gray during the winter months, and lines had appeared around his eyes and mouth that spoke of months spent squinting against wind and snow, of nights spent lying awake, worrying about supplies and survival. His hands, once smoothed from office work back in Illinois, were now permanently roughened and scarred from the constant labor of winter survival. Splitting wood with numb fingers, digging through ice and snow, handling rough tools and impossible conditions. But perhaps the most profound change was in his relationship with the land itself. Before the hard winter, he had seen his homestead as something to be conquered and controlled, a resource to be exploited for his family's benefit. Now, he understood that he was engaged in a partnership with forces far more powerful than himself, and that his survival depended not on domination, but on adaptation and respect. In the years that followed, Nelson would become something of a local expert on winter survival. Transformation that happened gradually as neighbors began to seek his advice and counsel. They would come to him in the fall, asking questions about storing food, insulating cabins, and managing livestock through the cold months. His reputation grew not from boastfulness or self-promotion, but from the quiet competence he displayed and the practical wisdom he had gained through bitter experience. He developed systems and practices that became models for the community. His method of insulating cabins, using banked snow and carefully placed windbreaks, was copied by newcomers. His technique for rationing supplies, calculating not just for the expected length of winter, but for a winter that might last a month longer than usual, became standard practice among those who trusted his judgment. His advice on livestock management was particularly valued. He had learned that animals needed more than just adequate food during extreme cold. They needed shelter from wind, access to unfrozen water, and careful monitoring for signs of distress. He shared techniques for keeping water from freezing, for recognizing the early stages of frostbiting cattle, and for calculating feed requirements that balanced survival against scarcity. But those who knew him well could see that the hard winter had left its mark in ways that went beyond practical knowledge. He never again looked at a clear autumn sky without wondering what lay ahead. Never again took for granted the simple comfort of a warm room and a full larder. There was a weariness in his eyes now, a constant awareness of how quickly circumstances could change and how thin the margin was between prosperity and disaster. This vigilance extended to every aspect of his life. He kept larger stores of food than seemed necessary, maintained his equipment with obsessive care, and always had backup plans for every essential activity. Some neighbors thought he had become overly cautious, even paranoid. But others, who had lived through their own hard times, understood that his caution was the wisdom of experience. The community itself was transformed by that winter in ways that would influence its development for generations to come. Families that had survived formed bonds that lasted lifetimes, united by the shared memory of months when their very existence had balanced on the edge of disaster. These relationships were different from ordinary friendships. They were forged in desperation and tempered by mutual dependence, creating a network of support that transcended normal social boundaries. The Larsons, the Norwegian family, whose generosity had helped Nelson's family survive, became lifelong friends, despite the language barriers that sometimes made communication difficult. Henrik and Nelson would spend hours together, sharing techniques for farming and survival. Their friendship deepened by the knowledge that they had helped each other through the darkest time either had ever experienced. They developed new customs and practices, ways of helping each other, that acknowledged how quickly prosperity could turn to desperate need. The community established informal but effective systems for sharing resources during emergencies, for checking on isolated families during severe weather, and for pooling knowledge about survival techniques. One such practice was the winter visiting system that developed in the years following the hard winter. Families would take turns hosting gatherings during the coldest months, providing not just social interaction, but opportunities to share resources and information. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They allowed people to check on their neighbors' welfare, to share news and practical advice, and to maintain the social bonds that isolation threatened to erode. The sharing went beyond material goods to include knowledge and skills. Women shared techniques for stretching food supplies, for making clothes last longer, for treating illness with available remedies. Men exchanged information about weather patterns, about the behavior of animals during severe cold, about construction techniques that could better withstand winter's assault. The hard winter became a reference point for all future difficulties. Other challenges were measured against it and usually found wanting. When crops failed, or livestock died, or accidents occurred, people would say, "Well, at least it's not as bad as the hard winter." Somehow that comparison made current troubles seem more manageable. But the winter also became a source of pride, a badge of honor for those who had lived through it. Survivors would identify each other with subtle references and shared understanding, members of an exclusive club whose membership requirements had been survival itself. Children born after the hard winter would grow up hearing stories about it, tales that seemed almost mythical in their extremity, but were vouched for by parents and neighbors who bore the visible and invisible scars of that experience. The settlement's physical development was also influenced by the lessons of the hard winter. New buildings were constructed with better insulation and more effective heating systems. Barns were built closer to houses, with covered walkways when possible. Root cellars were dug deeper and lined more carefully, every aspect of frontier construction was examined and improved based on what had been learned during those terrible months. The community also developed better systems for communication during emergencies. A network of signal fires was established, allowing isolated homesteads to communicate basic information about their status during severe weather. Simple codes were developed. 1 fire meant all was well. 2 fires indicated the need for assistance. 3 fires meant urgent help was required. These improvements weren't dramatic or revolutionary. They represented the accumulated wisdom of a community that had learned from near disaster. Each small change was based on specific memories of problems encountered during the hard winter, practical solutions to challenges that had almost proved fatal. Years later, when Nelson was an old man sitting by a comfortable fire in a well-built house, a house that incorporated every lesson he had learned about winter construction, he would sometimes catch himself listening to the wind and remembering those months when every gust carried the possibility of death. The sound of wind around the eaves would transport him instantly back to that small cabin where his family had huddled together, measuring out beans one by one and wondering if spring would come in time. But more often, he remembered the quiet strength of his family, the way Sarah had maintained her dignity and grace even in the worst circumstances, the resilience of his children, who had found ways to laugh even when hunger gnawed at their bellies. He remembered the unexpected kindness of neighbors like Henrik Larsson, who had risked his own life to share what little he had. He remembered the way ordinary people had found extraordinary reserves of endurance when faced with nature's most severe test. The memories weren't all dark. There had been moments of unexpected beauty. The way morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, creating patterns that seemed designed by an artist. The profound silence that followed a blizzard, when the world seemed to hold its breath and wonder at its own transformation. The warmth that seemed to radiate not just from their fire, but from their closeness to each other. The way extreme circumstances had stripped away everything non-essential and revealed what truly mattered. He remembered Christmas morning when they had awakened to find that Sarah had somehow managed to create small gifts for the children. Dolls made from scraps of fabric for Mary, a wooden horse carved from a piece of firewood for Tom. The gifts were simple, almost to the point of crudesse, but the children had received them with a joy that expensive toys could never have inspired. That Christmas had taught them all that happiness didn't depend on abundance, but on love and hope and the determination to find meaning even in the darkest circumstances. Sarah, gay-haired now, and still fighting the cough that had never entirely left her, would join him by the fire on winter evenings, and they would sit in comfortable silence, each lost in their own memories of that terrible and transformative time. Sometimes she would reach over and take his hand, and he would feel again the strength that had sustained their family through those months of trial. "We were lucky," she would sometimes say, though they both knew that luck had had little to do with their survival. They had survived through preparation, determination, mutual support, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. But Sarah's use of the word lucky encompassed more than just survival. They had been lucky to face the crisis together, lucky to have neighbors who cared about their welfare, lucky to discover reserves of strength they hadn't known they possessed. Their children, now grown with families of their own, would visit during the winter months, bringing grandchildren who had never known real hardship, but who listened with wide eyes to stories of the hard winter. Mary, now a capable woman who managed her own household with quiet efficiency, had inherited her mother's strength and practical wisdom. Tom, grown tall and strong, had become a successful farmer who always kept larger stores of supplies than seemed necessary. His childhood memories of hunger, making him cautious about abundance. The grandchildren would hear the stories with the mixture of fascination and disbelief that children reserve for tales that seemed too extreme to be true. How could people really live on just beans and salt pork for months? How could it be so cold that spit would freeze before hitting the ground? How could snow really pile up higher than a man's head and stay that way for months? But Nelson and Sarah would show them the artifacts that remained from that time. The coffee mill that had ground seed wheat into flour. The scales improvised from boards and stones to measure animal feed. The Bible that had provided comfort during the darkest nights. These physical reminders made the stories real, transformed them from fairy tales into family history. The hard winter passed into local legend, told and retold by those who lived through it. But the telling never quite captured the reality of those long months when survival was measured not in days, but in hours, when warmth was more precious than gold, and when the simple act of waking up each morning was a small victory against the vast, indifferent cold. The stories became part of the region's identity, shared not just within families, but throughout the community and beyond. Newspaper reporters would come to interview survivors, trying to capture the drama and human interest of the experience. Books were written, some accurate and some sensationalized, but none quite able to convey the grinding day-to-day reality of survival under such extreme conditions. But for those who had lived through it, no external validation was needed. The hard winter remained a private truth, a shared understanding that required no explanation or elaboration. Part of their fundamental understanding of what life could demand and what human beings could endure, the winter had taught them lessons that went far beyond practical matters of survival. They had learned that community was not just a convenience, but a necessity. That individual strength was meaningless without mutual support. They had discovered that hope was not an emotion, but a decision, something that had to be chosen and maintained through conscious effort, even when circumstances provided no logical reason for optimism. They had learned that dignity could be maintained even in the most desperate circumstances. It was possible to remain fully human, even when reduced to the most basic level of existence. The winter had stripped away everything they thought they needed and revealed what they actually required: food, shelter, warmth, and each other. Most importantly, they had learned that survival was not just about living through crisis, but about what kind of people they chose to be while facing it. The hard winter had presented them with countless opportunities to abandon their principles, to become selfish or cruel, or to give up hope. Some had succumbed to these temptations, but most had found ways to maintain their humanity even under the most inhuman conditions. This was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Not just that they had survived, but that they had survived with their essential selves intact. Their capacity for kindness and hope and mutual care not just preserved, but strengthened by the experience. The hard winter had tried to reduce them to mere animals fighting for survival. But they had refused that reduction, choosing instead to remain neighbors, friends, and family, even when such choices seemed impossible. As Nelson sat by his fire, in his comfortable house, surrounded by the prosperity that had come in the years following the hard winter, he understood that the terrible winter had been more than just a trial to be endured. It had been a teacher, harsh and unforgiving, but ultimately invaluable, showing him and his community what they were truly capable of when everything else was stripped away. The hard winter was over, had been over for decades, but its lessons lived on in the careful preparations of each autumn, in the generous sharing that characterized the community, in the quiet strength of people who had learned that they could survive anything if they faced it together. It lived on in children who had grown up hearing the stories, who had carried forward the knowledge that human beings could endure far more than they ever imagined possible. And perhaps most importantly, it lived on in the understanding that true wealth was not measured in material abundance, but in the strength of relationships, the depth of community bonds, and the knowledge that when the worst happened, people would take care of each other. The hard winter had taken much, but it had given something precious in return: the certainty that they were stronger than they knew, more resilient than they had dared to hope, and more connected to each other than the ordinary routines of prosperity had ever revealed. The story of the hard winter would be told and retold for generations. But for those who lived through it, it was more than a story. It was the foundation of their understanding of what it meant to be human, to be part of a community, to face the unknown with courage and hope. It was the proof that even in the darkest times, even when survival seemed impossible, people could find ways not just to endure, but to preserve the best of themselves for the spring that would surely come. Let us now drift from daily struggle into mystery, into the quiet corners of history, where survival techniques developed over generations have faded like smoke into the winter air. As we move deeper into the night, imagine walking through the ruins of abandoned homesteads, where archaeologists have uncovered the ingenious, desperate, and sometimes beautiful ways people adapted to survive winters that could kill. The wind carries whispers across these forgotten places, where the foundations of human endurance still mark the landscape like ancient runes. Here, beneath layers of snow and time, lie the secrets of a survival so complete, so all-consuming, that it transformed ordinary people into architects of their own salvation. Each ruin tells a story of adaptation so profound that it challenges our understanding of what humans can endure when they must. In the archives of small historical societies scattered across the northern plains, there are photographs of sod houses that look at first glance like gentle hills rising from the prairie. But look closer, and you begin to see the subtle signs of human habitation. A stovepipe emerging from what appears to be empty ground. A doorframe set into the side of what looks like a natural hillock. Windows that peer out from caves that are somehow too regular, too purposeful to be natural formations. These structures represent one of the frontier's most effective but least celebrated adaptations to extreme cold. The sod house, built from blocks of prairie turf cut with special plows, provided insulation that wooden cabins could never match. The thick walls of earth and grass roots held heat like a giant thermal mass, maintaining temperatures that, while never warm, remained survivably cool even when the outside air dropped to lethal levels. The construction of these earthen fortresses required knowledge that went far beyond simple building techniques. Settlers learned to read the prairie like a vast library, identifying the specific types of grass whose root systems would hold together under stress, whose density would provide the perfect balance between insulation and structural integrity. They discovered that sod, cut in autumn, when the roots had completed their growing season, created blocks that would settle and cure through winter into walls nearly impervious to wind and cold. Some families developed sophisticated techniques for layering different types of sod, creating walls with varying insulation properties throughout their structures. Archaeological evidence suggests that the most successful sod houses had walls built in careful patterns. Denser, tighter blocks on the north side to resist the bitter winter winds. Looser, more insulating blocks on the south side to capture and hold whatever warmth the weak winter sun could provide. But the real mysteries lie in the details that ordinary people developed through trial and error, techniques that were never written down in farming manuals or government pamphlets, wisdom that passed from neighbor to neighbor in whispered conversations during brief winter visits. These were the small innovations born of necessity, refined through desperate winters, and then forgotten as prosperity and modern heating made them unnecessary. Consider the practice of newspaper insulation technique that archaeologists have discovered in the walls of cabins throughout the Northern Territories. Families would save every scrap of paper that came their way: old newspapers, catalog pages, letters, anything that could create an additional barrier against the cold. They would paste these papers to the inside walls of their cabins in overlapping layers, creating a space filled with trapped air between the paper and the logs. The effect was subtle but significant, often meaning the difference between a cabin that could be heated and one that remained perpetually cold, despite constant fires. The application of this newspaper insulation became an art form in itself. Families developed specific patterns for overlapping the papers, techniques for making primitive paste from flour and water that would hold through months of extreme temperature changes, and methods for covering the papers with cloth or hides to prevent them from absorbing moisture from cooking and breathing. Some families created elaborate collages on their walls, arranging newspapers and catalog pages and patterns that provided both insulation and a form of primitive interior decoration during the long months when beauty was a necessity for psychological survival. In some ruins, archaeologists have found evidence of even more desperate measures. Layers of cloth, sometimes entire garments, had been stuffed into wall cavities. In one cabin site in North Dakota, researchers discovered the remains of what had once been a wedding dress, carefully cut into strips and used as insulation. The silk fabric, preserved by the dry conditions, still showed traces of lace and pearl buttons, a poignant reminder of how survival could require the sacrifice of everything beautiful and precious. These textile discoveries reveal a hierarchy of sacrifice that developed within frontier families. Archaeological evidence suggests that clothing was dismantled in careful order. First, the garments that were purely decorative. Then pieces that could be replaced with animal hides or rough homespun. And finally, in the most desperate situations, the essential garments that protected human skin from the cold. In several cabin sites, researchers have found entire layers of insulation made from children's outgrown clothing, suggesting that families systematically converted every scrap of fabric into a barrier against the killing cold. The mystery of fuel extends beyond the obvious scarcity of wood on the treeless plains. Native American techniques, quietly adopted by white settlers who were too proud to admit they were learning from indigenous peoples, provided solutions that sound almost magical in their ingenuity. The practice of burning twisted hay, for example, was an art form that required specific knowledge of grass types, moisture content, and twisting techniques that could make prairie grass burn hot and long. Master hay burners could identify dozens of different prairie grasses by their burning characteristics. Blue stem grass, when twisted with just the right amount of moisture and wound into tight spirals, would burn with an intense heat, perfect for cooking. Switchgrass, gathered at a specific time in its growing cycle, could be prepared to burn slowly and steadily for hours. Some families developed secret techniques for treating dried grass with animal fat or rendered bone marrow, grating fuel bundles that burned with the intensity of hardwood. The art of hay preparation occupied entire seasons. Families would gather specific grasses during narrow windows when their burning properties were optimal, then spend weeks preparing and storing these fuel bundles in elaborate systems that kept them dry while allowing proper aging. Archaeological evidence suggests that some families built special storage structures, partially underground chambers lined with stones and roofed with sod, where hundreds of prepared fuel bundles could cure through autumn and remain available throughout winter. Buffalo dung, called chips by polite society, became a science unto itself. Experienced settlers could judge the quality of buffalo chips by their color, weight, and the sound they made when struck. Fresh chips burned hot but fast, while older, weathered chips burned with a steady, even heat that was perfect for cooking. The best chips were those that had aged for exactly the right amount of time, dried by sun and wind, until they achieved the perfect balance of combustibility and burn time. The collection and preparations of buffalo chips developed into elaborate family enterprises. Children learned to identify prime chips from distances of hundreds of yards, reading the subtle signs of moisture content, age, and composition that determine burning quality. Families developed tools specifically for chip gathering, special scoops and baskets that kept their hands clean while allowing efficient collection. Some families built dedicated chip storage areas with sophisticated ventilation systems that allowed continued drying while protecting the fuel from rain and snow. In the archaeological record, there are tantalizing hints of survival practices that have been almost entirely lost. Excavations of cabin sites reveal small underground chambers carefully lined with stones that seem to have no obvious purpose. Some historians believe these were ice cellars that worked in reverse during winter, spaces where the natural insulation of the earth could keep stored food just warm enough to prevent total freezing, creating a natural refrigeration system that kept supplies usable throughout the long months when hunting and gathering were impossible. These underground storage systems represent some of the most sophisticated engineering found on the frontier. Archaeological evidence suggests that families dug these chambers to precise depths, calculating the exact point where earth temperature would remain stable regardless of surface conditions. Some chambers show evidence of elaborate ventilation systems, carefully designed air shafts that allowed just enough circulation to prevent spoilage while maintaining optimal storage temperatures. The contents of these chambers, when preserved enough to identify, reveal careful planning that extended through entire seasons. Families stored not just food, but tools, spare clothing, medicines made from prairie plants, and even small supplies of emergency fuel. Some chambers contained ceramic vessels filled with rendered animal fat, providing both emergency food and material for waterproofing and tool maintenance. Others held carefully wrapped bundles of seeds, ensuring that survival through winter would not compromise the following year's crops. The mystery deepens when we consider the social aspects of winter survival. Letters and diary entries from the period hint at practices that were never fully explained, customs that developed within isolated communities and died with the people who created them. References to warming parties appear in several sources, gatherings where families would combine their resources to heat a single, larger space, sharing fuel and food while maintaining warmth through collective body heat. But the exact protocols of these gatherings, how they were organized and maintained, remained frustratingly vague. Archaeological evidence suggests that these warming parties were more elaborate and systematic than casual references indicate. Some cabin sites show evidence of temporary wall modifications, places where internal walls could be removed to create larger spaces, or where additional heating systems could be quickly installed to support larger groups. Excavations have revealed networks of cabins connected by underground passages, allowing families to move between structures without exposure to deadly cold. The logistics of these gatherings required sophisticated planning. Families had to coordinate food supplies, fuel resources, and sleeping arrangements for groups that might include dozens of people. Archaeological evidence suggests the development of detailed protocols for sharing resources, rotating responsibilities, and maintaining sanitation in crowded conditions. Some sites show evidence of temporary structures built specifically for these gatherings, large communal spaces that could be quickly erected and heated for short periods. There are whispered stories preserved in oral histories collected decades later from elderly survivors. Families who developed their own secret languages during the long winter months, confined to single rooms for weeks at a time. Some households created elaborate systems of gesture and expression that allowed communication while conserving the breath that created visible clouds of moisture in the frigid air. Children would later recall their parents conducting entire conversations through subtle movements of hands and eyes, saving their voices for only the most necessary words. These communication systems developed into sophisticated nonverbal languages. Archaeological evidence suggests that some families carved symbolic marks into wooden surfaces, creating reference systems for their gesture languages. Survivors described elaborate storytelling traditions conducted entirely through movement and expression, epic tales that could unfold over weeks without a single spoken word. The silence itself became a survival tool. Families learned that excessive talking increased moisture in already humid cabin air, contributing to dangerous ice formation on walls and windows. They developed techniques for communicating essential information through the subtlest gestures, saving their voices for emergencies or the rare moments when the warmth was sufficient to make speech comfortable. The archaeological evidence suggests that some families developed remarkably sophisticated systems for maximizing the heat from their fires. In cabin ruins, researchers have found networks of channels carved into the floors connecting the fireplace to other areas of the room. These channels, covered with flat stones, allowed heated air to circulate beneath the living space, creating a primitive but effective radiant heating system. The knowledge required to design and build such systems suggests a level of engineering skill that developed through desperate innovation. These heating systems reveal understanding of thermodynamics that rivals modern engineering. Some cabin sites show evidence of heat exchangers built into chimney systems, devices that captured waste heat from smoke and redirected it back into living spaces. Families learned to build fires in specific patterns that maximized heat production while minimizing fuel consumption, creating controlled burns that could maintain warmth for hours with minimal feeding. The most sophisticated systems included thermal storage elements, networks of stones and earth that absorbed heat during peak burning periods and radiated warmth long after fires burned down to coals. Some families built their entire living spaces around these thermal mass systems, creating microclimates that could sustain human life even when outside temperatures dropped to levels that would normally mean certain death. Perhaps most mysteriously, there are references in several sources to a practice called stone warming that went far beyond the simple heated stones placed in beds. Some families apparently developed elaborate systems of rotating heated stones through their living spaces, creating networks of thermal mass that could maintain warmth for hours after the fire burned low. The stones were wrapped in specific materials, wool, leather, sometimes even paper, and moved through the cabin in patterns that maximized heat distribution while minimizing heat loss. These stone warming systems required careful selection of stone types. Families learned to identify rocks that would absorb and hold heat without cracking, domes that would maintain temperature for specific periods, and materials that could be safely heated without releasing dangerous gases. Some families developed specialized tools for handling heated stones, tongs and carriers that allowed safe movement of thermal mass weighing hundreds of pounds. The wrapping materials for heated stones became another frontier science. Families experimented with different fabrics and hides, learning which materials would transfer heat slowly and safely, which would prevent burns while maximizing thermal benefit. Some wrapped stones were designed to provide heat for specific body parts. Foot warmers with special shapes, hand warmers that could be carried during essential outdoor work, bed warmers that could keep a sleeping person alive through the coldest nights. The mystery of winter communication extends beyond individual families to entire communities. How did scattered homesteads separated by miles of impassable snow maintain contact during the worst storms? There are hints in the historical record of signal systems, arrangements of poles or cloths that could be seen from great distances, coded messages that could be read by those who knew the system. But the details of these communication networks, if they existed, were never formally recorded. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities developed sophisticated visual communication systems. Excavations have revealed tall posts positioned at specific intervals across the landscape, placed to be visible from multiple homesteads. Some of these posts show evidence of attachments for flags or cloths, suggesting coded message systems that could relay information across vast distances. The signals themselves apparently carried complex information. Oral histories mentioned systems that could communicate everything from medical emergencies to weather warnings to requests for assistance. Some families developed their own variations of these systems, creating private communication networks that allowed coordination of activities across multiple homesteads. In the deeper mystery of adaptation, we find evidence that some frontier families borrowed more extensively from Native American practices than they ever admitted in their letters or diaries. Techniques for sleeping in groups to maintain body heat, methods of food preservation that utilize the extreme cold itself as a preservation medium, practices for maintaining mental health during months of isolation and confinement. All of these show influences that suggest a quiet exchange of survival knowledge between cultures that were officially in conflict. Archaeological evidence reveals the extent of this cultural exchange. Cabin sites show indigenous construction techniques integrated with European building methods, creating hybrid structures that combine the best survival strategies from both traditions. Food storage systems show clear native influences, preservation techniques that utilize traditional indigenous knowledge of prairie ecology and seasonal cycles. The psychological survival techniques show perhaps the strongest indigenous influence. Practices for maintaining mental health during isolation, methods for structuring time during months of confinement, and techniques for preserving community bonds across long separations all show elements that suggest direct learning from Native American communities who had survived prairie winters for generations. The most haunting mysteries are those revealed by what archaeologists don't find. In some cabin sites, there are no remains of furniture, no evidence of beds or chairs or tables. These families apparently burned everything combustible during their final winter, feeding their last possessions to the fire in a desperate attempt to survive until spring. In these empty spaces, the silence tells a story more powerful than any artifact. These sites of ultimate sacrifice reveal the terrible calculations that survival required. Archaeological evidence suggests careful prioritization in what was burned. First, decorative items, then furniture that could be replaced with improvised alternatives, then finally, essential items like beds and tables, when no other fuel remained. Some sites show evidence that families burned their own floors and walls, stripping away parts of their shelter to feed fires that kept them alive for a few more days. The order of destruction in these sites reveals the psychology of survival. Personal items with sentimental value were often preserved until the very end, suggesting that families maintained hope and identity even as they systematically destroyed everything they owned. Children's toys, family photographs, religious items. These were the last things fed to fires, marking the moment when survival required the sacrifice of everything that made life meaningful beyond mere biological continuation. And there are the cabins that were simply abandoned, left with everything intact, as if the inhabitants had stepped out for a moment and never returned. In these frozen tableaux, archaeologists have found meals still laid out on tables, clothing still hanging from pegs, children's toys still arranged as if play had been interrupted by something too urgent to delay. These sites speak to the thin line between survival and surrender. Two winters that tested human endurance beyond its breaking point. These abandonment sites preserve moments of decision that reveal the ultimate limits of human endurance. Some show evidence of careful preparation for departure: food packed, essential items gathered, fires safely extinguished. Others suggest sudden flight: doors left open, fires still burning when snow covered everything, possessions scattered as if families had moments to choose between survival and death. The mystery of these abandonments extends beyond individual tragedies to larger questions about the limits of human adaptation. Some sites suggest that families reached points where continued effort would have meant certain death, where the only rational choice was to attempt desperate journeys to find help. Others seem to mark moments when people simply chose to stop fighting, when the cost of survival exceeded their capacity to continue. The mystery extends into the realm of the psychological, to the techniques people developed for maintaining sanity during months of confinement. There are references to winter crafts that went beyond simple utilitarian work, elaborate projects that served no practical purpose except to occupy the mind during the endless hours when survival required only waiting. Some families created intricate decorative objects from scraps of material, carved elaborate designs into wooden objects, or developed complex storytelling traditions that could stretch a single tale across multiple evenings. These psychological survival techniques represent some of the most sophisticated aspects of frontier adaptation. Archaeological evidence suggests that families developed elaborate systems for structuring time during confinement, creating artificial seasons and celebrations that provided psychological anchors during months when external reality offered no variation or hope. The crafts themselves became forms of meditation and mental discipline. Families learned to work with whatever materials were available, transforming scraps of cloth into elaborate quilts, carving kitchen utensils into works of art, creating toys and games that could occupy children for weeks. Some families developed writing systems, creating elaborate journals and stories that serve both as entertainment and as ways of preserving their experiences for future generations. The storytelling traditions that developed during these winter confinements created entire universes of imagination that helped families transcend their physical circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests that some families created elaborate props and costumes for storytelling, transforming their cabins into theaters where epic tales could unfold night after night. These stories often incorporated elements of their own survival experiences, creating myths and legends that helped them understand and cope with their extraordinary circumstances. As we drift through these mysteries of adaptation and survival, we are reminded that the frontier was not just a place of individual heroism, but a vast laboratory where human ingenuity was tested against the most severe natural conditions. The solutions that emerged were often beautiful in their simplicity, tragic in their necessity, and now largely lost to history. The winter wind that still blows across the northern plains carries the whispers of these forgotten techniques, these lost arts of survival that helped ordinary people endure extraordinary cold. The legacy of these survival techniques extends beyond their immediate practical applications to reveal fundamental truths about human adaptability and resilience. The people who developed these methods were not experts or specialists, but ordinary families forced by circumstances to become innovators and engineers. Their solutions reveal capacities for creativity and endurance that challenge our assumptions about human limitations. The beauty of these adaptations lies not just in their effectiveness, but in their integration of practical necessity with aesthetic sensibility and psychological insight. Even in the most desperate circumstances, frontier families found ways to preserve dignity, beauty, and hope. Their survival techniques were not just about staying alive, but about remaining human in circumstances that threatened to reduce existence to mere biological function. In the deep quiet of archaeological sites, where foundation stones mark the places where families once huddled through brutal winters, there is a sense of presence of lives lived with an intensity that prosperity has made unnecessary. The mystery is not just what these people did to survive, but how they maintained their humanity, their connections to each other, and their hope for spring in the face of such relentless testing by the natural world. These sites serve as monuments to human endurance and creativity, marking places where ordinary people achieved extraordinary adaptations to impossible circumstances. The techniques they developed represent a lost knowledge base and accumulated wisdom about survival that modern comfort has rendered unnecessary, but which reveals profound truths. It's about human potential when survival depends on innovation and endurance. The whispers that carry across these ancient homestead sites speak not just of survival, but of transformation, of ordinary people who discovered capacities they never knew they possessed, who created beauty and maintained hope in circumstances that would defeat most modern attempts at endurance. Their legacy challenges us to understand survival not just as a biological imperative, but as an art form that requires the integration of practical skill, creative intelligence, and spiritual resilience. In these forgotten corners of history, we find evidence that human adaptation extends far beyond simple biological survival to encompass the preservation of culture, creativity, and hope, even under the most extreme conditions. The mystery of winter survival on the frontier ultimately reveals the mystery of human nature itself, our capacity to endure, adapt, and transform even the most hostile environments into places where human life and dignity can flourish. As we near the end of our quiet journey through winter on the frontier, let us turn our attention to a different kind of shelter, a different experience of the same merciless cold. While families like Nelson's counted their dwindling supplies and fed their last furniture to the fire, others found ways to cushion themselves against winter's edge, creating islands of warmth and comfort in the vast sea of cold that covered the American West. Picture, if you will, the grand stone mansion of William Palmer in Colorado Springs, its windows glowing golden in the winter darkness of 1881. Inside, gaslight-illuminated rooms paneled in imported walnut, where oriental carpets covered floors, warmed by coal furnaces that burned steadily day and night. Palmer, the railroad baron who founded the city, sat in his leather-holstered chair before a massive fireplace, reading telegrams from the east, while his household staff prepared dinner with ingredients shipped in specially heated railroad cars that could push through snow drifts that stopped ordinary trains. The contrast was not lost on Palmer himself, who understood that his comfort depended on the same railroad lines that brought supplies to isolated settlements, when those lines could run at all. But his wealth provided buffers that most settlers could never imagine. When coal ran short in the public areas of Colorado Springs, Private cars could travel to the mining camps in the mountains, returning with fuel that kept his furnaces burning, while others rationed their heat carefully through the long winter nights. In Denver, the mining millionaires who had struck silver in the high mountains created their own version of winter luxury. The Brown Palace Hotel, opened in 1892, boasted steam heat throughout its 9 stories, electric lighting powered by the city's first power plant, and dining rooms that served oysters shipped from the Atlantic coast and specially insulated cars. Guests could enjoy champagne and imported delicacies while blizzards raged outside, their comfort dependent on supply chains that reached back to the industrial cities of the East. But even wealth could not entirely escape winter's reach. The very wealthy learned that comfort was fragile, dependent on systems that could fail. When the railroad lines were blocked for weeks at a time, even the grandest mansions began to feel the pinch of scarcity. Coal delivery stopped, imported foods ran out, and the wealthy found themselves learning lessons in conservation that their money had previously made unnecessary. Mrs. Augusta Tabor, wife of the Silver King Horace Tabor, wrote in her diary during the severe winter of 1884 about the strange experience of rationing. Coal, in her grand home in Leadville. "We have closed off the 3rd floor entirely," she noted, "and the servants have been moved to rooms nearer the kitchen fires." It is remarkable how quickly one learns to treasure warmth when it becomes precious rather than assumed. The military installations scattered across the frontier represented another form of institutional privilege in the face of winter hardship. Fort Laramie in Wyoming, Fort Robinson in Nebraska, and dozens of other Army posts were supplied by government contract with provisions that were supposed to see them through the winter months. But even these official outposts were not immune to the realities of frontier winter. Major James Powell, commanding Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming Territory, found his garrison reduced to eating horse meat when supply trains failed to get through the mountain passes during the brutal winter of 1866. The soldiers, supposedly protected by the might of the federal government, discovered that institutional support meant little when nature closed the supply lines that connected them to the outside world. The contrast between military comfort and civilian hardship was often stark, but not absolute. Officers' quarters were heated with government coal and furnished with official supplies, while enlisted men crowded into barracks heated by whatever fuel could be acquired locally. But when the supply wagon stopped moving, even generals found themselves wearing multiple layers of uniforms and sleeping under piles of army blankets in rooms where their breath created visible clouds. In the railroad towns that sprouted along the transcontinental lines, a new form of frontier aristocracy emerged, men who controlled the flow of goods and people across the vast western distances. These railroad executives built themselves heated offices and comfortable homes, but their prosperity was directly tied to keeping the trains moving through conditions that often made such movement impossible. Charles Francis Adams, president of the Union Pacific Railroad, spent the winter of 1881 in his luxurious private car, traveling between snowbound stations to personally oversee the efforts to keep the lines open. His car was heated by its own coal stove, fitted with comfortable sleeping quarters, and stocked with provisions that would have fed a frontier family for months. Yet even Adams found himself stranded for days at a time, his mobile palace becoming a prison, when the forces of nature proved stronger than the forces of commerce. The cattle barons, who ran vast ranches across the northern plains, represented perhaps the most interesting intersection of wealth and vulnerability during harsh winters. Men like Granville Stewart in Montana and Conrad Kohrs in the same territory had built empires based on the free grass of the open range. But winter could destroy years of accumulated wealth in a matter of months. The winter of 1886 to 1887, known as the Great Dup, taught these cattle kings that even vast wealth could not protect against the mathematics of cold, snow, and starvation. Stewart, who had lived like a lord in his grand ranch house, watching over herds that numbered in the tens of thousands, found himself reduced to counting the frozen carcasses that emerged from the melting snow of spring. His comfortable mansion, with its imported furniture and well-stocked wine cellar, suddenly felt like a monument to hubris in the face of natural forces that recognized no human hierarchy. The mining camps in the high mountains created their own peculiar aristocracies, where the owners of successful claims could afford to have supplies packed in by mule train, even when the costs became astronomical. In Leadville, Colorado, at an elevation of over 10,000 FOT, winter was not just cold, but thinned and brutal. The wealthy mine owners built themselves heated offices and comfortable homes, but they were islands of warmth in a landscape where workers lived in drafty cabins and tents, burning whatever they could find to stay alive. The social dynamics of these contrasts were complex and often unstable. Wealth provided insulation against cold, but it also created dependencies that could prove fatal when systems failed. The wealthy needed servants to maintain their comfort, but those servants needed to be housed and fed, creating obligations that could become burdensome when resources grew scarce. Some wealthy families found themselves sharing their hoarded supplies with their workers, not from generosity, but from the practical understanding that their own survival depended on maintaining the loyalty of those who kept their fires burning and their food prepared. In the territorial capitals, Cheyenne, Helena, Bismarck, government officials lived in relative comfort, heated by public funds and supplied through official channels. But even these representatives of federal authority discovered that winter could reduce their grand offices to the same basic struggle for warmth that faced every frontier family. Territorial governors found themselves wearing overcoats in their offices and conducting official business in rooms where ink froze in the wells. The most poignant contrasts emerged in the small frontier towns where wealth and poverty lived side by side. The banker who foreclosed on struggling homesteaders might himself be reduced to burning furniture when his coal ran out. The merchant who charged desperate prices for scarce supplies might find his own family rationing food when the railroad stopped running. Winter was a great equalizer that could humble the proud and reduce the powerful to the same basic negotiations with cold and hunger that defined frontier life. Yet, even in these moments of shared vulnerability, the traces of privilege remained. The wealthy still had reserves to draw upon, savings accounts and Eastern banks, relatives who could send money by telegraph, investment properties that could be liquidated for emergency funds and might suffer during a hard winter. But they rarely faced the absolute desperation that threatened families who had nothing but what they could produce with their own hands. As spring finally came to the frontier towns and isolated ranches, the contrast became visible in the landscape itself. The grand houses emerged from winter with their structures intact, their foundations solid, their furnishings preserved. The cabins of the poor often showed the scars of desperate winters, missing floorboards that had been burned for fuel, furniture that had been sacrificed to the fire, walls that had been partially dismantled to feed the stove. The wealthy learned different lessons from hard winters than did the poor. Where the poor learned to hoard and conserve, the wealthy learned to diversify their resources and maintain multiple supply lines. Where the poor learned to make do with whatever was at hand, the wealthy learned the importance of maintaining emergency reserves and backup systems. Both forms of knowledge were valuable, but they reflected fundamentally different relationships to scarcity and abundance. In the end, winter on the frontier was a test that everyone faced, but not everyone faced equally. The cold wind that blew across the plains entered both mansions and sod houses, but it found different receptions in each. Wealth could not prevent winter from coming, but it could provide layers of protection that made survival more certain and comfort more possible. Yet even the wealthiest learned that their security was fragile, dependent on systems and supply chains that nature could sever with a single severe storm. The lesson of elite comfort in the frontier winter was not that money could buy immunity from natural forces, but that it could buy time, options, and margins for error that made the difference between survival and surrender. In the democratic severity of winter on the plains, even this advantage could prove insufficient, but it was an advantage nonetheless, one that shaped not just who survived, but how they understood their relationship to the land and to each other in the vast and different landscape of the American West. As our quiet journey through the frozen frontier draws to a close, we find ourselves returned to the present moment, to the warmth and security that most of us take for granted. The stories we have shared tonight of Nelson and his family enduring the hard winter, of forgotten survival techniques that helped ordinary people outlast extraordinary cold, the complex ways that wealth and poverty face the same merciless seasons. All of these remind us how far we have traveled from that world of constant negotiation with the elements. Think for a moment about the simple miracle of the warmth that surrounds you now. The heated room where you rest, the abundance of food in your kitchen, the layers of infrastructure and technology that stand between you and the kind of cold that once defined winter on the American frontier. These comforts, which seem so natural and permanent, represent generations of human ingenuity and social cooperation that have gradually built barriers between us and the raw forces of nature. Yet, there is something to be learned from those who endured the brutal winters of the Wild West. Something that speaks to the quiet strength that emerges when survival requires nothing more complex than patience, endurance. In the willingness to wake up each morning and begin again the simple tasks that sustain life. In their careful rationing of fuel and food, in their attention to the subtle signs of weather and season, in their understanding that comfort was a luxury and warmth was a treasure. They possessed a clarity about what truly mattered that our abundance sometimes obscures. The rhythm of their days, tend the fire, break the ice, feed the animals, mend what is broken, share what little you have, created a kind of meditation on survival that was both profound and practical. They knew things about cold and warmth, about scarcity and abundance, about the way communities form when individual survival depends on collective endurance, that we have largely forgotten in our heated, connected, abundant world. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, surrounded by the gentle warmth of modern comfort, you might take a moment to appreciate the simple miracle of steady heat, of abundant food, of medical care that can heal the illnesses that once proved fatal during hard winters. You might feel grateful for the infrastructure that connects you to resources from around the world, for the layers of civilization that stand between you and the kind of elemental struggle that defined life on the frontier. But you might also carry with you something of the quiet strength of those frontier families. Their understanding that survival often requires nothing more dramatic than the patient repetition of necessary tasks. Their knowledge that community emerges naturally when people share common challenges. Their appreciation for simple pleasures, a warm fire, a hot meal, the sound of wind outside walls that hold. Sleep approaches. Let yourself drift on the memory of their endurance, their quiet dignity in the face of hardship that would challenge any of us. The winter wind that once howled across the plains still blows, but now it blows over landscapes dotted with warm lights, heated homes, and people who have inherited the gifts of those who simply refuse to surrender to the cold. Rest now in the knowledge that you are connected to that long line of human persistence, that somewhere in your blood runs the memory of ancestors who knew how to endure, how to wait for spring with patience and hope, how to find warmth in each other when the world seemed determined to freeze them into stillness. The stories we have shared tonight were not stories of heroes, but of ordinary people doing what had to be done one cold day at a time, in their patient endurance, in their quiet strength, in their understanding that survival was not about conquering winter, but about outlasting it. They left us gifts of perspective that can warm us still, long after the last frontier cabin has crumbled back into the prairie soil. Sleep well, warmed by their memory, and know that spring always comes eventually to those who have the patience to wait for